For centuries, history books have told us that Anne Boleyn met a quick and merciful death. A clean strike of a French sword. A solemn crowd. Dignity in her final moments. But what if that version was never the truth? What if her execution wasn't a quiet act of justice, but a calculated spectacle, crafted to break her spirit, erase her name, and rewrite history itself? This wasn't just the fall of a queen. It was psychological warfare. From the moment Anne was arrested to the instant the sword fell, every detail was engineered to humiliate her, from the rumors that destroyed her reputation, to the eerie delays that kept her trapped in terror, waiting for a death she couldn't predict. What really happened inside the Tower of London that day wasn't mercy. It was a performance. And behind that performance stood a king desperate to silence the woman who once defied him. If stories like this make you question what we think we know about history, take a second to like this video. Subscribe for more untold truths hidden behind royal walls. And if you've ever wondered whether Anne was truly guilty, or just in the wrong place at the wrong time, stay till the end. You won't forget this one. Before Anne Boleyn ever stood on a scaffold, she stood at the heart of a revolution. She wasn't born to be queen. She wasn't royal. She was a courtier's daughter, raised in France, fluid in charm, wit, and ambition. When she returned to England, she carried something few women possessed at the Tudor court: confidence. She didn't just flatter men, she challenged them. And when King Henry VIII noticed her, she didn't melt at his attention. She resisted. That resistance became her power. Henry, used to obedience, was fascinated by a woman who wouldn't yield, and turned his pursuit into leverage. For years, she refused to be his mistress, demanding marriage instead. And against all odds, she won. Her victory came at a staggering cost. Henry broke from the Pope, severed ties with Rome, and upended centuries of religious authority just to have her. England's very soul was rewritten for Anne Boleyn. But her triumph made enemies. Nobles resented her influence. Courtiers whispered that she had bewitched the king. Even the people muttered that she had stolen England's faith for her own ambition. In a court ruled by politics and appearance, every smile, every word, every gesture was watched. Anne knew it, but she never bowed her head. She spoke her mind, debated theology with scholars, and even influenced policy. All acts that were, in Henry's world, unforgivable for a woman. And yet, for a time, she was unstoppable. When she was crowned in 1533, she seemed untouchable. The streets of London were filled with banners and trumpets, a celebration of the new queen. But beneath the cheers, discontent stirred. She had failed to give Henry a son. Her only surviving child was a daughter, Elizabeth. And though history would prove that girl to be one of England's greatest monarchs in 1533, she was a disappointment. Every month that passed without a male heir chipped away at Anne's position. Henry's affection cooled. Courtiers sensed the shift and began to circle. Behind closed doors, alliances formed. One man's frustration became another's opportunity. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's ruthless chief minister, saw what the king could not say aloud. Henry wanted freedom again, and to free himself, he needed Anne to fall. But Anne wasn't blind to the danger. She had seen what happened to women who lost a king's favor. Yet she refused to fade quietly. When she argued with Henry, she didn't beg, she reasoned. When accused of arrogance, she laughed it off. Her pride, once her strength, now sealed her fate. In a world built to break women, and dared to rise, she dared to think, to speak, to influence. And that was her greatest sin. Because in Tudor England, a woman could be loved, or feared, never both. Still, Anne believed her intelligence could protect her. She underestimated the cruelty of the world she lived in. Every decision she made, every word spoken in confidence, would soon be twisted into evidence of treason. Her enemies didn't just want her gone, they wanted her erased. She had changed the course of England, but soon she would learn the truth of power. In Henry's court, love could make you a queen, and love could turn into the weapon that killed you. The Tudor court was a stage, and every player had a script. But in Anne Boleyn's case, the lines were being rewritten, and not by her. As months turned into years, her once blazing marriage began to dim. Henry VIII, impatient and easily swayed, grew tired of defiance. The queen who had challenged kings and toppled popes now faced a court full of men eager to watch her fall. And in that world, whispers were more deadly than swords. It began quietly, a sideways glance, a half-heard joke, the suggestion that, and was too familiar with certain courtiers. Names began to circulate, musicians, noblemen, even her own brother. Most of these rumors came from the shadows, seated by those who knew exactly how to please the king. For Henry, whose pride was as fragile as his temper, even the idea of betrayal was enough to plant suspicion. But Anne's real crime wasn't love or lust. It was power. She had grown too confident, too outspoken, too visible. She argued politics, influenced church appointments, and clashed with Cromwell over royal finances. In a patriarchal court built on obedience, she had become dangerous. Cromwell saw what Henry could not admit. The queen who once empowered him now threatened his control. And so, the whispers found a home. Every laugh and shared, every gift she offered, became ammunition. The court's corridors echoed with stories, invented, exaggerated, or twisted from half-truths. She was accused of mocking the king, of predicting his death, of flirting with courtiers. These weren't random lies. They were carefully planted seeds, designed to bloom into outrage. Even Anne's allies began to waver. The same nobles who once bowed before her now avoided her gaze. They knew how quickly loyalty could become a death sentence in Henry's England. The court learned long ago that survival meant silence, and sensed the shift. She saw the change in the king's eyes, colder, more distant. His touch lingered less, his laughter faded faster. The man who had risked his soul to have her now barely spoke to her. She confronted him, but Henry's answers were clipped, evasive. He claimed stress, affairs of state. But she knew better. There was another woman. Her name was Jane Seymour. Demure, obedient, everything and refused to be. Wild and had captivated Henry through defiance. Jane won him through submission. Cromwell saw it too, and used it. Jane became the perfect contrast, the quiet answer to Anne's fire. By spring of 1536, Anne stood on unstable ground. Her miscarriages had shattered Henry's hopes of a son. Rumors whispered she had cursed her own womb. In a court ruled by superstition, misfortune was never innocent. Each tragedy became another sign that God had turned against her. And so Cromwell acted. He began collecting evidence, confessions coerced, testimonies fabricated. Servants were questioned, friends detained. One by one, men close to and were arrested. She didn't know it yet, but the noose was already tightening. The queen who had once shaped England's destiny was now trapped in a web of deceit, spun by those who feared her influence. And in a court where the king's will was law, truth no longer mattered. Because in Tudor England, it wasn't guilt that condemned you. It was power, and still had too much of it. It was May 2nd, 1536. The day began like any other in the glittering world of the Tudor court. But by nightfall, the Queen of England would be a prisoner, and had attended Mass that morning, unaware that her enemies were already moving. Her musicians had been taken for questioning. Courtiers she once trusted had vanished from the palace. Even her brother George was being watched. Still, and tried to carry herself with grace, refusing to show fear. But whispers reached her ears, of arrests, of interrogations, of accusations too wild to believe. That afternoon, a royal messenger arrived. The king wanted her gone from court. She was to be taken to the Tower of London. When the words left his lips, the room fell silent, and stood frozen, her composure cracking for the first time. The Tower, the place of coronations and celebrations, now became a tomb. As her barge crossed the Thames, she must have remembered the last time she saw those gray walls. 3 years earlier, she had entered the Tower as a bride-to-be, preparing for her coronation. Trumpets had sounded, flags had flown, crowds had cheered. Now, the same waters carried her back in silence. The only sound was the oar's slow rhythm, a countdown to ruin. When she stepped ashore, the lieutenant of the Tower bowed. "Madam, you are welcome." It was a cruel formality, and reportedly replied, "If it be truly so, I thank you, but I fear your welcome will be short." Her words revealed what she already knew. This was no misunderstanding. This was the end. Inside, guards escorted her through cold stone corridors to her quarters. They were the same royal apartments that had once hosted her coronation banquet, but now they were stripped bare, silent, echoing. She was told the charges: adultery, incest, treason, crimes that struck at the very heart of monarchy, and protested. She swore her innocence, demanded to face her accusers. But there would be no fair hearing. Her fate had already been sealed. That night, she prayed, her mind spinning through the accusations. They claimed she had plotted to poison the king, that she had seduced multiple men, including her brother, that she had laughed when Henry fell from his horse, wishing for his death. Every story more absurd than the last. But absurdity didn't matter. In Henry's England, truth was whatever the crown declared. As darkness fell, and wept, not for herself, but for Elizabeth, she knew what would come. The title princess would be stripped. Her daughter would be branded a bastard. In a single decree, Henry could erase their legacy. And while in knelt in prayer, Henry dined with Jane Seymour. The man who once called her the most perfect woman now refused to see her. His silence was a verdict louder than any trial. Outside, the city buzzed with gossip. Londoners argued over whether their queen was guilty or cursed. Some pitied her. Others rejoiced. But no one doubted she was doomed. That night, alone in the tower, and realized the truth. Her trial was not about justice. It was theater. Her downfall was a script already written, and the final act had just begun. 17 days. That's how long and Boleyn waited inside the tower. 17 days, trapped between hope and horror. At first, she believed Henry might show mercy. Surely, she thought, he would see the lies for what they were. She prayed, clung to reason, told herself the man who defied Rome to marry her could not now destroy her. But every dawn brought only silence. No message, no visit, no sign of compassion. Inside those cold stone rooms, the air felt heavy. Guards watched her every move. Her ladies, once friends, were now spies. Anything she said could be twisted, recorded, used. Even her laughter, even her prayers. Cromwell's men reported everything. They wanted to catch her off guard, to make her seem unhinged, guilty, unstable. At times, she broke into sudden fits of emotion, laughing one moment, weeping the next. To those watching, it looked like madness. But to anyone who's ever faced despair, it was something else entirely. A mind trying to survive the unbearable. Henry had ordered her execution, but he delayed it again and again. Each postponement stretched her torment. She never knew when her final hour would come. Would it be today? Tomorrow? The not knowing was its own cruelty. Outside, London's gossip grew louder. People whispered about her supposed lovers. They laughed at the scandal, eager for spectacle. Few realized how carefully it was all staged. Cromwell controlled every rumor, feeding the story that Anne was dangerous, a schemer, a witch, a woman too proud for her place. The same qualities that once made her magnetic now damned her. And yet, she didn't crumble. Witnesses wrote that and remained strangely composed. She joked with her attendants, even made light of her small neck, saying, "I have but little neck, and the executioner is good, and I have heard he is very sharp." That grim humor wasn't madness, it was survival. At night, she prayed aloud, asking for forgiveness not for her crimes, but for those who wronged her. She begged God to protect her daughter. She told her ladies she hoped Henry would be good to Elizabeth. It was a mother's last wish, one she knew would likely go unanswered. Meanwhile, her enemies celebrated. Cromwell boasted that he had planned all. The queen would die, and with her, the threat she posed. Her fall was not just punishment, it was policy. When news of the men's executions reached her, her alleged lovers, including her own brother George, Anne collapsed. She knew then there was no path left. Henry had made his decision. The trials were a formality. But even broken, and refused to confess. No matter what they promised or threatened, she held her innocence. In a court built on lies, truth became her final act of defiance. As the days passed, the sound of hammers echoed across the tower grounds. Workers were building a small scaffold, not the grand platform used for traitors. This one was low, intimate, humiliating. It would bring her face to face with the crowd. By the 18th day, and stopped asking for mercy. She asked only for speed. And on the morning of May 19th, 1536, when the guards came for her, she smiled, not because she welcomed death, but because, at last, the waiting was over. When Henry ordered a French swordsman instead of an English headsman, most assumed it was an act of mercy. After all, the axe could be clumsy. One blow often wasn't enough. A sword, wielded by a trained executioner, promised swiftness, clean, humane. But this was Henry VIII. Nothing he did was simple kindness. Every choice served a purpose. And this one turned his death into theater. In England, executions followed tradition. A condemned noble knelt before the block. The headsman raised his axe high. The crowd gasped. The strike fell. But a French swordsman? That was foreign, strange, unsettling. Henry knew it would draw attention. He wanted it that way. This was not justice. It was performance. The man was summoned across the channel at great expense. Reports say he practiced on animals to ensure precision. He never met Anne, never spoke to her, never looked her in the eyes. To him, she was a task, a payment earned by perfect skill. But to Henry, that detachment was ideal. The stranger carried no history, no emotion, no hesitation. It stripped the act of any intimacy, and would die at the hands of a man who did not know her, in a ritual designed to erase her identity. While she waited, and was told the sword had arrived. Imagine hearing that, knowing your executioner was en route, traveling across countries just to end you. It wasn't mercy. It was suspense. Each mile he covered, each day he drew closer, added to the torment. Henry's court prepared the scene carefully. The scaffold was built low, only 3 feet off the ground. That meant when Anne knelt, she would face the crowd directly. No height, no grandeur, no distance from the jeers. It forced her humiliation into focus. And while the workers built, Henry dined and danced. The same man who once called her his heart's desire now celebrated her replacement. Jane Seymour waited quietly in the background, the next queen in waiting. Henry moved on before the sword even touched English soil. For Anne, the symbolism was cruel. The French sword, elegant, foreign, precise, echoed her own story. Once admired for her sophistication, now condemned by it. Her refinement, her intellect, her very Frenchness, had made her powerful. Now those same traits made her alien. And Cromwell ensured every detail would send a message. The French method would show the world Henry's grace. The Queen's death would seem orderly, merciful, a farce of kindness covering deliberate cruelty. Witnesses later said the executioner asked for forgiveness before striking, a custom in his homeland, and granted it. "I willingly forgive you," she said, her voice steady. "Do your office." Even at the end, she followed ceremony. Dignity was the only power she had left. But Henry's choice of weapon told the truth. This wasn't a private punishment. It was a royal production, meant to be remembered. The French sword wasn't mercy. It was spectacle. When Anne was told her execution would take place the next morning, she thanked the guards. Her calmness startled them. But after 17 days of fear, even death felt like relief. That night, as London slept, the foreign swordsman prepared his blade, and in the tower, and whispered her last prayers, knowing that the man who once swore eternity now couldn't wait one more day for her to die. The morning of May 19th, 1536, was bright, too bright. Sunlight spilled through the narrow windows of Anne's chamber, lighting the same stone walls that had trapped her for weeks. She had been awake since before dawn. Sleep had become impossible. Every sound, every step in the corridor, might have been the one that came for her. Around 2 in the morning, she called for the sacrament. Her ladies later said she prayed for hours, sometimes silently, sometimes aloud. She wasn't asking for rescue anymore, only peace. When the guards arrived after sunrise and greeted them with a strange calm, "I am ready," she said. Her voice was steady, even cheerful. It unsettled those who heard it. But what else was left? Fear had nothing new to offer her. She dressed carefully, simplicity over splendor, a gray damask gown, an ermine cloak, and a small headdress to cover her hair. Every detail mattered, and knew her death would be remembered. And if she could not live as queen, she would at least die with dignity. As she stepped out into the morning light, witnesses noted her composure. Some thought it courage, others thought madness, and had learned that appearances were all that remained. If she must die in front of hundreds, she would not let them see her break. The walk to Tower Green was short, yet each step carried the weight of a life rewritten. 3 years ago, she had walked the same path for her coronation procession, surrounded by music and roses. Now, only the sound of boots on stone followed her. When she emerged into the open square, a murmur rippled through the crowd. Nobles, courtiers, servants, even commoners, had gathered to watch. Some came from curiosity, others from loyalty, some from spite, but all came to witness the fall of a queen. The scaffold stood low, barely waist-high. Not the towering platform of myth, but a small wooden stage, rough and simple. It forced and close to her audience. Every expression, every breath, visible. The crowd could look directly into her eyes as she knelt. That was no accident. It was design. She was given a final chance to speak. Tradition demanded it. Mercy did not, and looked at the crowd and spoke softly, her voice carrying over the square. Good Christian people, I am come hither to die according to the law, and thus yield myself to its judgment. She did not confess. She did not plead. Her words accepted the law, not the lie. A subtle defiance, veiled in obedience. She then praised the king, calling him merciful, kind, and good. Some took it as forgiveness. Others saw what it was, strategy. A final attempt to protect Elizabeth. Anything bitter, anything proud, might be used against her child. So and chose silence disguised as praise. When she finished, she turned to her attendants and smiled faintly. Pray for me. Then she removed her headdress, tucking her hair beneath the linen cap, so it would not catch the blade. Witnesses said she knelt upright, not resting her head on a block, but holding perfectly still, hands clasped in prayer. Beneath the blindfold, her lips moved. Some swore they heard her whisper, To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. The swordsman waited for his moment. She never saw the strike. The square fell silent. Even the birds seemed to pause, and knelt upright, her small frame poised in stillness. The morning sun cast a pale light over Tower Green. Somewhere in the crowd, a child began to cry, hushed quickly by a mother's trembling hand. Every eye fixed on the queen, who would soon be no more. The French swordsman stood behind her, calm, measured. He was a professional, trained to strike once, and cleanly. But the cruelest part of the French method was not the blade. It was the weight, and could not see him. The blindfold blocked the world. She could only hear the scrape of steel, the shuffle of boots, the whisper of breath. She did not know the instant it would come. The uncertainty was its own torture. Then, without warning, the executioner called out to his assistant, "Bring me the sword." It was a trick, meant to distract her. As she turned her head slightly, the blade flashed. In one motion, swift and silent, it was done. Her body remained upright for a heartbeat before collapsing. The head, light and small, rolled gently to one side. Witnesses later swore her lips still moved, as if finishing a prayer cut short. Others said her eyes blinked, once, twice, before growing still. Science tells us that may be possible. In those final seconds, some fragment of consciousness may linger, aware that life has ended but not yet gone. The crowd gasped. Some wept. Some turned away. A few fainted, but no one cheered. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. Her ladies rushed forward, tears streaming, gathering what was left of their queen. There was no coffin, no royal procession, only a rough wooden chest, one that once held arrows. They placed her body inside, wrapped hastily in linen. Her head, still crowned with its simple cap, was laid beside it. The Frenchman bowed, received his coin, and vanished. He would leave England that night, his work done. For him, it was just another execution. For England, it was the destruction of a queen. But even in death, and was denied peace. No proper burial awaited her. No prayers were read aloud. Her remains were carried to the nearby chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, buried beneath the floor, with no marker, no ceremony. The queen who had once been crowned in splendor at Westminster now rested in silence, beneath the feet of others. As word spread through the city, bells tolled. But they did not mourn her. They celebrated the king's freedom. Within hours, Henry received confirmation of her death. By sunset, he was with Jane Seymour. A day later, the court prepared for a new queen. For those who had loved Anne, the horror was unspeakable. The women who served her would never forget what they saw. One later entered a convent, broken by the memory. Another was said to wake at night screaming. They had watched their queen die, not as a traitor, but as a warning. And in that moment, England learned a truth that would echo for centuries. In Henry's world, loyalty meant nothing. Love was temporary, and power could turn affection into execution faster than any blade. And Boleyn's death did not end her punishment. It only began a new one, the erasure of her existence. Henry VIII wanted more than her life. He wanted her memory gone. To the world, she would be nothing but a scandal, a cautionary tale whispered with contempt. And so, almost immediately after her execution, the work began. Orders spread quietly across the court. Her portraits were removed from royal halls. Her initials, once carved beside Henry's in stone and wood, were chiseled out. Even her emblem, the falcon crowned in gold, was stripped from tapestries and books. It was as if she had never lived, never ruled, never given birth to a princess. Her name was forbidden in conversation. Courtiers who had once sought her favor now pretended they had never known her. To speak of Anne was to risk suspicion. Silence became survival. Henry's propagandists told a new story, one where he had shown great mercy. They called the French sword of kindness. They painted Anne as unfaithful, ambitious, dangerous. And they told the people that justice had been served, that the king had spared her suffering. It was a lie built on theater. Her death, staged to appear swift and noble, hid the cruelty that came before it, the torture of uncertainty, the humiliation, the psychological breaking. But truth no longer mattered. Henry had the throne, and with it, control of history. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of her downfall, continued his rise. For a time, he prospered. He had delivered what Henry wanted, freedom and silence. Yet even he would one day meet the same fate, condemned by the same system he once mastered. Anne's few remaining supporters tried to preserve her legacy in secret. The poet Thomas Wyatt, who had once admired her, wrote verses mourning her death, lines that compared her small, delicate neck, once adorned with jewels, now severed and discarded. His words carried sorrow, but also warning. In Henry's England, even beauty could be fatal. Meanwhile, the Tower's attendants remembered the burial. They said her grave was marked only by a few loose stones, unnumbered among other traitors. For centuries, no one could say exactly where she lay. It wasn't until the 19th century that her bones were believed to be found, mixed among others, forgotten in the floor she once walked upon. But Henry's greatest act of erasure was aimed not at Anne, but at her daughter. Elizabeth, just 2 years old, was declared illegitimate. Her royal title was stripped, her small household dismissed. Court records show that for months, the child was left without proper clothing or care. She was the living reminder of a woman England was ordered to forget. And yet, fate had its own plans. The king's effort to erase, and only deepened her myth. Every attempt to silence her gave birth to whispers. Every destroyed image left a ghost behind. People spoke of her quietly. The queen who rose too high. The woman who lost her head for love. Henry could control the court. He could control the story. But he could not control time. Because one day, that forgotten daughter would rise. And with her, the name in Boleyn would return to history. Not as a traitor, but as the mother of a queen. When Anne Boleyn was buried beneath the Tower floor, her daughter was barely 3 years old. Little Elizabeth never saw her mother again, never heard her voice, never knew why her name had become forbidden. But even as a child, she lived in the shadow of her mother's fall. Almost overnight, her world changed. The servants who once doted on her were dismissed. Her fine clothes were taken away. The title princess was stripped from her name. In its place came Lady Elizabeth, a subtle but brutal reminder that she no longer belonged to the royal line. She was sent away from court, hidden behind estates and tutors, while her father celebrated his new marriage. Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife, became the queen, and soon after gave birth to a son, a boy, the heir Henry had always wanted. For Elizabeth, that meant invisibility. She was not hated, only ignored. And for a child born of love and ambition, neglect was its own kind of cruelty. But as she grew, so did the whispers. Tutors spoke of her intelligence, her sharp tongue, her curiosity. She devoured books, languages, philosophy. Like Anne, she refused to be ordinary. Even as a girl, she showed flashes of the same mind that had once captivated a king. And Henry noticed. Slowly, perhaps grudgingly, he began to see himself in her. The stubbornness, the wit, the will. He restored her to partial favor, though never fully to legitimacy. Yet no matter how much he tried to forget Anne, Elizabeth's eyes, dark and watchful, reminded him of the woman he destroyed. Those around Elizabeth learned quickly not to mention her mother. The very name and Boleyn carried danger. But silence does not erase blood. In portraits of Elizabeth as queen, historians later saw echoes of Anne, the tilt of the chin, the poise, the steady gaze that seemed to challenge anyone who met it. It's impossible to know how much of her mother's story Elizabeth understood. Records show she once asked a tutor about Anne, only to be told it was best not to speak of her. She never asked again. But deep down, she must have known. In a court that thrived on rumor, her mother's name was everywhere, even in absence. When Elizabeth finally took the throne in 1558, she did something no historian could miss. She reclaimed what was denied. She never spoke of Anne directly, but she honored her through action. She restored the Boleyn arms, celebrated her lineage, and ruled with the same sharp intellect that once terrified men in Henry's court. And in doing so, she rewrote the story her father had tried to bury. The bastard became a queen. The erased child became England's golden monarch, and had died believing her name would vanish. Yet through Elizabeth it endured. Every law she passed, every speech she gave, every victory she won, all were echoes of the woman who refused to bow, even when facing the blade. And Boleyn may have been erased from stone and scripture, but not from legacy. Her daughter's crown was proof that history can be rewritten, not by kings, but by time. And in that, Henry's greatest triumph became his greatest defeat. Centuries have passed since the morning and Boleyn knelt on Tower Green, yet her story refuses to fade. It lingers in the silence of the tower, in the words of poets, in the face of the daughter who outlived her father's shadow. Anne's death was not just the fall of a queen. It was a mirror held up to power, showing how absolute authority bends truth, rewrites history, and decides who is remembered and who is forgotten. In Tudor England, guilt didn't matter. What mattered was convenience. When a woman's intelligence became threat, when her voice grew too loud, when her influence reached too high, her downfall was inevitable. Anne's execution proved that truth is fragile when power writes the script. Every part of her story was shaped to serve someone else's purpose. Her love became sin. Her wit became arrogance. Her silence became confession. The crown she earned through defiance became the weapon that killed her. And yet, in trying to erase her, Henry only made her immortal. History has since tried to untangle the lies from the record. Letters, poems, testimonies, all hint at a woman both brilliant and flawed, proud yet vulnerable, ambitious yet deeply human. She wasn't a witch or a saint. She was a survivor until survival was no longer possible. What makes her story endure isn't just tragedy. It's recognition. Because Anne's fall reveals something universal. How easily truth can be crushed beneath power. How quickly a narrative can be rewritten when one voice controls the pen. Cromwell called her death a triumph of justice. Henry called it God's will. But history calls it what it was. A political execution dressed as mercy. A public lesson that even queens could be broken if they forgot their place. And yet, in the quiet of centuries, her voice still returns. Every retelling, every historian study, every dramatization is an act of resurrection, proof that even the most carefully buried stories find a way back to light. Anne's greatest revenge was not rebellion. It was legacy. The daughter she left behind grew into one of England's most formidable monarchs. Under Elizabeth, the kingdom flourished in art, exploration, and power. The girl once stripped of her title became a symbol of strength, and through her reign, Anne's name, once cursed, was whispered again with respect. That is the irony history cannot escape. The same man who tried to erase her ended up fathering a dynasty defined by her blood. And Boleyn's life reminds us that power can silence a voice, but not the truth behind it. Every lie told to destroy her eventually unraveled. Every attempt to forget her only made her story louder. In the end, her death was not simply a punishment. It was a performance, one meant to frighten others into obedience. But centuries later, the audience sees what they tried to hide, that beneath the politics and spectacle was a woman who dared to exist beyond the limits imposed upon her. And that is why Boleyn endures, not as victim, not as villain, but as a warning. Because when truth depends on power, justice becomes theater. And history, if left to kings, becomes fiction. Anne's voice was silenced in life, but in memory it speaks still, clear, defiant, and unforgettable. And Boleyn's story isn't just about the fall of a queen. It's about the cost of power, the danger of truth, and the strength of legacy. She entered history as a symbol of ambition, intelligence, and defiance. She left it as a warning of how absolute authority can twist love into judgment and loyalty into death. But centuries later, her name stands not for shame, but for resilience. The woman they tried to erase became the mother of a dynasty. When you walk through the Tower of London today, you can still feel her presence, quiet, unyielding, unforgettable. Every stone seems to remember. Every shadow still whispers her name. And maybe that's the lesson and leaves behind. You can destroy a person, but you cannot erase the truth. History tried to silence her, but history failed. If this story made you rethink what really happened inside those walls, take a moment to like this video. Subscribe for more untold stories that expose the human cost of power and remind us how easily truth can be buried. And as you leave the story behind, remember, Anne's voice may have been taken, but her legacy speaks louder than ever. The question is, how many other truths are still waiting to be heard?